Under the direct orders of Stalin, Igor Kurchatov, a brilliant physicist known as the Beard, led the Soviet A-bomb team. They were determined to end the atomic monopoly America had held since the war. On the 29th of August 1949, they succeeded. The nuclear arms race had begun.
What a thrill, with darkness and silence through the night. What a thrill, I'm searching and I'm melting to you. What a fear in my heart, but you're so supreme. I give my life, not for honor, but for you. In my time, there'll be no one else. And still in a dream, snake eater. Someday you go through the rain, and someday you'll feed on a tree frog. It's ordeal, the trial to survive. For the day we see new light, I give my life, not for honor, but for you. In my time, there'll be no one else. Crime, it's the way I lie to you. I'm still in a dream, snake eater. I'm still in a dream, snake eater.
1945. La Deuxième Guerre mondiale s'achève avec plus de 50 millions de morts, dont une majorité de civils. Alors que se créent les Nations Unies et que s'entrevoit déjà la guerre froide, le Comité international de la Croix-Rouge mesure l'impérieuse nécessité de faire reconnaître aux États une protection particulière pour les civils. Réviser le droit de la guerre existant et créer une nouvelle convention de Genève pour protéger les civils, tels sont les impératifs du CICR, qui aboutiront en 1949 à la signature de 4 conventions de Genève.
We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself.
Franklin Roosevelt pioneered a foreign policy based on oil. Roosevelt understood that oil was a decisive factor in America's victory in World War II. We triumphed over the Germans and Japanese, true by military prowess and the leadership of our generals, but also because the U.S. had a superior industrial capacity. We were able to produce so many thousands of tanks and planes, and we had the petroleum to fuel those weapons, whereas the Germans and Japanese did not. But at the same time, Roosevelt understood that the United States would no longer be able to supply its forces with oil in the future because we were using up so much of our domestic reserves. And this is what worried Franklin Roosevelt most in the final months of World War II. And so he set out to find a foreign source of oil to make up for the decline in American reserves.
One of the most colorful visits to the presidential cruiser was that of the ruler of Saudi Arabia, King Ibn Saud. The 65-year-old monarch leaves his country for the first time to attend this.
You have to picture this extraordinary moment at the end of World War II between the President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and the King of Saudi Arabia, Abdulaziz ibn Saud. On one hand, the leader of the free world, a passionate advocate of democracy and freedom, sitting next to an absolute monarch who is accompanied by slaves and astrologers and Bedouin bodyguards. No records were kept of this meeting. The basis of the discussion was that henceforth the United States would provide the royal family with protection in return for an exclusive American right to develop Saudi Arabia's oil. And every American president since then has reaffirmed the U.S. alliance with Saudi Arabia.
During the last Great War, the most powerful men in America, China, and the Soviet Union had a secret pact. The pact was a blueprint for defeating the Axis powers and creating a new world order. To secure victory in the war, the three countries pooled their resources to conduct the most covert types of operations and research. The atomic bomb, rocket technology, the Cobra unit. And they amassed an enormous sum of money to fund these projects, enough to fight the war 5 times over. That wealth is the philosopher's legacy. After the war was won, the three countries were to divide the philosopher's legacy amongst themselves. My father was one of the men in charge of managing the philosopher's legacy. In the confusion that ensued after the war ended, he devised a series of ingenious plots to ensure that the Soviet Union would have total control over the legacy. The money was divided up and laundered through banks all over the world.
Unconditional surrender had brought the fighting to an end, but not the dying.
There was no food in Japan, and we had a population on the verge of starvation.
There were long lines of women trying to get water from pumps.
The Japanese government had told people to supplement their starch intake by eating acorns, peanut shells, and sawdust. Protein could be had by eating grasshoppers, mice, rats, and snakes. President Harry S. Truman appointed five-star General Douglas MacArthur Supreme Commander of the occupation of Japan. MacArthur was given unprecedented powers to shape post-war Japanese society. 1,000 Japanese civilians were reported to have died from starvation. Something needed to be done. But feeding the Japanese was more than just a humanitarian concern.
The doctrine of military government was to maintain law and order. The greatest threat to law and order would come from the opposition of people who were being deprived. So it was any military government official would have known that he had to avert what they called disease and unrest by supplying with whatever they could.
He said, the people are starving here, and you're either going to have to send me food or bullets.
MacArthur had made his point. Within days, Daniel McGovern and his crew filmed American ships arriving in Tokyo Harbor, carrying food that had been warehoused around the Pacific in preparation for the invasion of Japan. MacArthur wanted to liberate the Japanese from their own past. He ordered every arriving GI to watch an orientation film that made clear their mission.
The end of the war. The beginning of another peace. Peace, if we can solve the problem of 70 million Japanese people. Here's where we clinch our victory or we muff it. Our problem's in the brain inside of the Japanese head. Physically no different than any other brains in the world. These brains, like our brains, can do good things or bad things, all depending on the kind of ideas.
Hirohito would continue to rule on condition that he enthusiastically promoted MacArthur's transformation of Japanese society.
The best thing he did, saved the emperor. If emperor was a war criminal and punished, will be a disaster. Some Japanese will, commit suicide or try to kill MacArthur, or will be a very bad situation.
MacArthur wasn't just tinkering with Japanese society, he was transforming it.
Most of the people who were involved in planning the reforms in Japan believed that these were the ways society should be organized. Any society would be better off if it were organized this way as opposed to the way the Japanese had organized themselves. Not only because this would bring more peace, but also because it would bring more prosperity.
Censorship was lifted, but there was one exception. No criticism of the occupying forces, especially Douglas MacArthur. Daniel McGovern's film unit had entered a city reeling from the enormity of defeat. But nothing in Tokyo prepared him for his next assignment. He was ordered to travel south and film the aftermath of the atomic blasts in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The bomb had exploded right above the Sai Hospital. 32 of the city's first aid stations and 18 of its hospitals had been reduced to rubble. 90% of the city's 200 doctors had been killed or disabled. Those who survived fled or were swamped by the wounded. In one of the few hospitals that remained standing, 8 doctors and 8 nurses treated over 10,000 patients. In both atomic cities, McGovern recorded operations performed without anesthetics. Children so badly burned that it seemed impossible that they could live. this 8-year-old boy did manage to recover from his burns.
And I think we photographed more children because they were the ones that were suffering the most. And some of the patients, the adults, just faded away or just died. Sometimes we'd be photographing the person there and just pass away.
When bodies were found, they were cremated. When ashes were found, they were placed in small boxes and handed to relatives. Each of these boxes contains the remains of someone killed in the atomic explosions. Then came burial. This procession was filmed on a country road leading out of Hiroshima. For months, it seemed as if all the living could do was bury the dead. MacArthur had hoped the Japanese government would come up with its own constitution to guarantee basic rights for its citizens. But by February 1946, he concluded that the establishment was incapable of change. So he decided to impose a constitution of his own and gave his staff exactly 1 week to draw one up. 22-year-old Beata Sirota was given the task of writing the articles on women's rights.
They had no rights whatsoever. Really nothing. They were supposed to be treated like children, everything decided for them. A man could divorce a woman in Japan, but a woman could not divorce a man. She had no property rights, no inheritance rights, no rights for domicile, nothing like that. And it really wasn't very difficult to think of rights for Japanese women because you could start from zero.
Once MacArthur had approved the constitutional draft, the government of Japan was powerless to prevent it. One of the most innovative elements was the pacifist clause, ensuring there would never again be a mighty Japanese fleet. MacArthur, then having decided the emperor should not be tried as a war criminal, sent him out of Tokyo to promote the democratic constitution. These were unprecedented scenes, as Hirohito met his countrymen for the first time. No longer a god, just a man demonstrating that the country had to change to survive. On April the 10th, 1946, 14 million Japanese women were among those who went to the polls in the first free election in Japanese history. But there were still great challenges ahead. In the year that followed the surrender, Japan had to absorb one of the greatest repatriations in history, when more than 5 million Japanese returned home. They came from the far reaches of the former Japanese Empire. 1.5 million from China, 1 million from Manchuria, 500,000 from Formosa, and 2 million from Siberia, the Philippines, and Korea. Disease followed. At one point, 22 ships carrying 76,000 repatriates had to be quarantined after a cholera outbreak. Almost 500 died before the epidemic was brought under control. Many of the Japanese soldiers showed signs of depression that eventually led to suicide. All were warned that they were likely to have lost both their homes and their families. They were sprayed head to foot with DDT and discharged with only the uniforms on their backs. They were the new outcasts, men who were seen to have disgraced the emperor and brought shame and defeat on the nation. As the Cold War began, Japan became an ally, and old suspicions began to fade away. Americans, enchanted by the beauty of the country and its ancient traditions, helped to erase the memories of war. McGovern's camera captured moments that proved the new relationship went beyond political expediency.
Oh, how well I remember that. I can see it now. The young 18-year-old walking down arm in arm with the pretty 17 or 18-year-old Japanese girl. And he was just she would push his hand away, or he would try to grab her, you know, in an affectionate way, you know.
The World Bank and IMF originated in the rubble of the Second World War. As the war was ending, Europe was in ruins, its economy and population shattered.
At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 Allied and Associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference.
The conference created a new world economic order by establishing the World Bank and IMF.
The British controlled Palestine, and they promised the Jews a homeland here. The problem was, there were more than 10 times as many Arabs as Jews already living in Palestine. And as hundreds of thousands more Jews poured into the country, open fighting broke out between them. By 1947, things were so bad, the United Nations stepped in with a plan. This is how Palestine looked then. Lying on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, it was bordered by Lebanon, Syria, Transjordan, and Egypt. The United Nations suggested partition. The Palestinians would keep land here, here, and here, and the Jews would have the rest. Jerusalem would be an open city shared by everyone. The Jews accepted the plan, and in 1948, they declared their independence as the State of Israel. But the Palestinians and the neighboring Arab countries rejected partition. War followed, and the borders changed once more. The Israelis took over Arab lands here in the north and along the Egyptian border, ending up with most of Palestine and most of the key city of Jerusalem. Tens of thousands of Palestinians fled or were expelled from their homes. These refugees headed to neighboring Arab countries, creating a refugee crisis that lasts to this day.
Klaus Fuchs, a German-born British citizen.
People used him as a babysitter. He was a very polite, very quiet individual. No idea at all that he had this dual personality or this dual endeavor.
In January 1950, Fuchs was arrested in London and charged with passing atomic bomb designs to the Soviet Union. He was sentenced to 14 years for espionage. At the Los Alamos nuclear laboratories, they planned the hydrogen bomb. America feared that if it didn't build an H-bomb, the Russians would. President Truman gave the go-ahead. The Pacific atoll of Eniwetok was chosen to be the site of the world's first thermonuclear explosion. While America was developing the hydrogen bomb, a conventional war had broken out in Asia.
The fact that communist forces have invaded Korea is a warning that there may be similar acts of aggression in other parts of the world.
It was November 1st, 1951. I was in the Nevada desert participating in atomic testing. Snake, you and I are alike. We're both slowly being eaten away by the karma of others. We'll never have the chance to die peacefully of old age. We have no tomorrow. But we can still have hope for the future.
Later that year, the Soviet leadership witnessed a demonstration of their nuclear power.
Атомная бомба сброшена.
American tests in the Pacific continued. In 1954, shrimp was expected to explode with a force of about 5 megatons, but the calculations were wrong. Winds spread radioactive fallout much further than expected.
We had not been prepared to have such a high yield, so the fallout area was much larger. And unfortunately, there was a Japanese fishing vessel, I think called the Lucky Dragon, where some of this fallout came down on them. And they had no information as to what this was. They were a long ways away, and before any information got to them or they were detected, some of the people did suffer some radiation effects.
The fishermen had been over 80 miles away when they were caught in a cloud of radioactive dust. Once again, the Japanese have been poisoned by ashes of death, reported one Tokyo newspaper. All 23 crewmen fell ill. One died.
At United Nations headquarters in New York, United States President Eisenhower arrives to make a proposal for the constructive use of atomic power.
Atomic bombs today are more than 25 times as powerful as the weapons with which the atomic age dawned, while hydrogen weapons are in the ranges of millions of tons of TNT equivalent. Today, the United States stockpile of atomic weapons, which of course increases daily, exceeds by many times the total equivalent of the total of all bombs and all shells that came from every plane and every gun in every theater of war in all of the years of World War II. a single air group, whether afloat or land-based, can now deliver to any reachable target a destructive cargo exceeding in power all the bombs that fell on Britain in all of World War II. But let no one think that the expenditure of vast sums for weapons and systems of defense can guarantee absolute safety for the cities and citizens of any nation. Should such an atomic attack be launched against the United States, our reactions would be swift and resolute. But for me to say that the defense capabilities of the United States are such that they could inflict terrible losses upon an aggressor, for me to say that the retaliation capabilities of the United States are so great that such an aggressor's land would be laid waste, all this, while fact is not the true expression of the purpose and the hope of the United States. So my country's purpose is to help us move out of the dark chamber of horrors into the light, to find a way by which the minds of men, the hopes of men, the souls of men everywhere can move forward toward peace and happiness and well-being.
This is the muddy, backwoods Tallahatchie River, where a weighted body was found, alleged to be that of young Emmett Till.
I saw a hole, which I presumed was a bullet hole, and I could look through that hole and see daylight on the other side.
When white women was on the streets, you had to get off of the street. That was a way of life. And all a white woman would have to say was, that nigger kind of looked at me, assessed me. So we're talking about a way of life that was enforced by law.
Nelspruit, a small mining town in the northern Transvaal, has for the past week been the focus of the racial tension in South Africa. It started with a protest march by some 400 native women on the police station. The women have long been more militant in their resistance to apartheid laws in South Africa than have been their menfolk. And in Nelspruit this week, the African woman has suddenly become the focal point of resistance to the nationalist government. Nelspruit on the surface, this rainy, humid day, looks as quiet as that scene on that rustic front porch of the store. But in reality, Nelspruit is still tense after a week of trouble. Big trouble and violence, even in South Africa.
Here once flourished the great cities of the ancient world, for the Middle East is the birthplace of our civilization. Here the ancient Egyptians built structures never equaled by modern man. Here is holy Jerusalem, center of three of the world's great religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But today the Middle East is largely a barren land, which nature seems to have forsaken. There is great heat and bitter cold. few resources and little water, where food must be coaxed from the earth by man's ingenuity. The Middle East, or the Near East as it is also called, is centered on the Arabian Peninsula, which contains the large desert country of Saudi Arabia, fringed by several tribal territories. To the north, bordering the Soviet Union, are Afghanistan, Iran, which was formerly Persia, and Turkey, most European of these countries. Between them lies the smaller lands of Iraq, Syria, and Jordan. On the other side of the Red Sea is Egypt, with a narrow neck of land which contains the Suez Canal, of utmost importance in world shipping. Indeed, the Middle East lies at a world crossroads. It provides a land route between the three continents of Europe, Africa, and Asia, a water route through the Suez Canal, and a terminal for airlines bound east and west. The houses are ancient, usually made of stone or other readily available materials, with flat roofs covered with straw, which has been rolled into mud. Near the village are the common grazing grounds for the sheep. Mustafa owns 3 of the sheep. The others belong to different people in the village. One of the older boys guards them. The wool from these sheep, made into the famous Oriental rugs, or sold for export, is one of the few sources of cash income for the villagers. A recent development of major importance has been the discovery of vast oil deposits in many parts of the Middle East. These oil fields have been developed largely through foreign capital. The payment of royalties has bettered the financial position of some countries, although ownership of the oil fields has caused considerable political unrest. Much of the oil is exported in its crude state by huge tankers. Oil is found mostly in Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq, with several pipelines for the transportation of oil. Some is refined in the Middle East before shipment, and a growing number of modern refineries dot the area. Oil is the Middle East's major export. Its new position in world affairs is slowly bringing changes to the Middle East. There's a new spirit among the university students where women work and study on an equal basis with men, in a sharp break with ancient tradition. Government health centers have been set up in some of the cities. Modern communication is quickening the spread of new ideas. Old means of transportation are giving way to newer and better ones. The caravan is dying out in favor of the bus, the truck, and the airplane.
The beautiful, bedeviled land of voodoo, manacled to a rhythm of corrupt government and bloody revolution. Haiti, and in the heart of its capital, Port-au-Prince, the presidential palace. From this stately arsenal, an isolated, despairing nation's ruled by a man who is everywhere. No other land has such sickly impact. You see his iron grip in the guns of his chosen. You feel his menace in the pit of your stomach. You hear his presence in the silence of his subjects. Papa Doc, Dr. Francois Duvalier, spiritual leader and president for life. His years of absolute power have brought terror to his people, ruin to his country, and the inescapable threat: whoever destroys Duvalier destroys Haiti.
A hero to some, a monster to others. He hoped to start a third world war.
Ante las exigencias del imperialismo,
the CIA and American Special Forces conspired to bring him down. His death is shrouded in mystery, his body secretly buried in an unmarked grave. But the man they hoped the world would forget is the man who would become a legend.
This is a story of how the government of the United Kingdom decided to attack an Arab nation. Of how, afraid its oil supplies were under threat, it embarked on a strategy of regime change. Of how Britain deliberately bypassed the United Nations. And of how a British Prime Minister led the nation to war based on suspect intelligence. But this isn't Iraq 2003. This is Egypt, 1956.
At the time, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser was the most powerful man in the Mideast. He was an Arabian nationalist who hated Israel, the colonial powers, and the oil companies. From the English and the French, who operated the Suez Canal, he demanded payment of half of the fees. When both refused, he had the canal zone occupied and nationalized. For England's Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, Nasser was a second Hitler, whom one had to oppose with all one's might. In the meantime, the Arabs and the Saudis had stopped their oil shipments. In Europe, petrol became scarce, and the British, who since the downfall of their empire were basically bankrupt, ran out of money.
It is our hope and intent that this matter will be brought before the United Nations General Assembly.
After President Eisenhower refused to supply Paris and London with oil and money, the English and the French had no other option than to immediately withdraw and leave the reopening of the Suez Canal to the UN Blue Helmets, as initiated by Eisenhower. The new American President Eisenhower and his Secretary of State Dulles already saw all of the Mideast fall under Soviet influence. There was only one solution. Head of CIA, Alan Dulles, the brother of the Secretary of State, was assigned Operation Ajax. In his diary, President Eisenhower wrote about the CIA's success. The Operation Ajax seemed more like a dime novel than a historical fact. And the facilities remained in national possession. But for management and distribution, he needed a new partner. The Americans seized the opportunity. Under their leadership, they formed a consortium made up of 7 Western oil companies, among them 4 American and the British Anglo-Persian as a minority shareholder. From all revenues, the Shah received half. The oil from Abadan was flowing again.
It's a way for the United States to battle Russia. It's a way to, in the U.S. view, keep Russia in check in its own backyard. One can say with some confidence that the U.S. wouldn't be there at this strength, with this passion, if it were not for oil.
The Caucasus stands as a border between East and West, a battleground for Russia, the United States, and the great oil companies. The oil of the Caspian Sea is a hotly disputed commodity. In the midst of the derricks stands the ancient temple of Ateshgah, the House of Eternal Fire. a former sanctuary for the Zoroastrians, fire worshippers who traveled the old Silk Road from India. Many still come here to pay homage to Azza, or fire. After Italy's downfall in World War II, reconstruction was American-led. It was the price to pay for defeat. This exceptional man is called Enrico Mattei, the most important Italian since Julius Caesar, it is still said. A resistance hero and industrial genius, he decided to free Italy of its dependence on the oil majors. It was the beginning of a contest against those he called the Sette Sorelle, the Seven Sisters. Enrico Mattei launched his oil diplomacy campaign. In 1957, he signed a contract with Iran, leaving 75% of the profits to the producer. It was a bombshell in the Seven Sisters' backyard. He then turned to other countries, including Egypt and Nigeria.
Mattei è considerato un pirata con la sua formula, con le condizioni così vantaggiose che dà a piccoli paesi produttori di petrolio. È considerato un pirata perché le grandi compagnie petrolifere sono abituate a contare nei rispettivi paesi, sulla scena internazionale, addirittura più dei governi.
And yet Mattei dared the unthinkable. He worked directly with the USSR and met with the head of the Soviet parliament, Andrei Gromyko. The Soviets agreed to deliver large quantities of oil at a low price.
Mattei rompe completamente questo equilibrio con la sua iniziativa e va a fare accordi con l'Unione Sovietica per l'importazione di petrolio a prezzi molto, molto convenienti. Soprattutto altera l'equilibrio che è un equilibrio politico-diplomatico fissato.
The bear is a daunting creature. The Red Army, 5 million men and nuclear weapons. A vast war machine fueled by oil money.
Pour être toujours en mesure de contrer l'avance technologique des États-Unis, le gouvernement soviétique a été obligé de mobiliser des sommes très importantes. Avec quel argent les soviétiques finançaient cet effort du complexe militaro-industriel? Avec les exportations de matières premières, essentiellement d'ailleurs du pétrole et du gaz.